The world is hurting right now, and it's time to rise up. As we lift ourselves up in body, mind, and spirit, we can reach out to others and be a light in a sea of darkness. Welcome to the Movement for Global Health with your host, Dr. Mary Zennett.
Today, we are privileged to introduce to you Dr. John Lewis. Dr. John is past full-time and current voluntary associate professor in the prestigious Miller School of Medicine, specifically in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He is a firm advocate of natural health, and he has been the principal investigator in over 30 different research studies. He was the lead investigator of a groundbreaking study with patients with moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease that was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's in 2013. Today, we're going to talk more about the results of this study and where we move forward in the future. Dr. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Dr. Mary, thank you for having me. It's a very kind introduction, and I'm happy to be with you today to have this really nice conversation.
It's so important. So summarize for us the study. You studied patients with moderate to severe Alzheimer's. That in and of itself is amazing. So give us the overview.
It really is when you think about that patient population, if for no other reason, the fact that Big Pharma doesn't really care to study those folks because they view people at that level of severity as kind of being lost causes. So going back a few years ago when Pfizer basically completely discontinued their drug discovery program for dementia and Parkinson's because they said they were tired of spending billions of dollars on it. That was a lead story in Newsweek magazine, I think about 6 years ago. So I'm sure that gave a message to folks dealing with neurodegeneration about what Big Pharma thinks. And so anyway, we were very lucky. We had the generosity of a family who had a few family members die of Alzheimer's disease. And the wife of the family heard Dr. McDaniel, Dr. Reg McDaniel, my friend and dear friend and colleague, who was giving a lecture, and the lady decided to give a donation to us to help advance the science of nutrition. She was so encouraged by the results that he was showing in some anecdotal cases that she was so motivated and just happy to help her, do her part to help move this field forward. So as you know, Alzheimer's is the 6th leading killer of Americans. Forget having any kind of consensus on treatment. We can't even come to a consensus on what causes the disease. I mean, there are so many different theories about even what causes neurodegeneration, but we were working with the center here in Miami that has a lot of Alzheimer's patients. Now, interestingly, they were very skeptical of us. They thought, well, we only do pharmacology here. We don't do nutrition.
Right.
So we had a very healthy dose of skepticism right from the start in terms of, well, hey, what's this nutritional going to do? Like, we study drugs. We're at the top of the rung here. And, you guys are talking about this nutrition stuff we think is just kind of, hocus pocus, silly nonsense. But anyway, they said, well, you guys have some money and we have a lot of patients. So if for no other reason, we can help you out here and we'll see how it goes. No, I guess they felt like they didn't have much to lose since they were getting paid anyway. But the way we designed the study was we felt like we needed a pretty long intervention with people at this level of sickness. And of course, they didn't just have Alzheimer's, right? I mean, they had hypertension, diabetes, depression, different forms of heart disease. I mean, you name it, they had all sorts of comorbidities. So it wasn't like they only had Alzheimer's. But we put them on what we call this allopolymannose multinutrient complex on a 12-month intervention. We didn't change their medication. We didn't change their diet, their physical activity, their socialization.
Wow.
We literally didn't change any other variable or feature of the intervention. We simply introduced this dietary supplement into their daily routine. And I can tell you that very quickly within the study, we started getting, really encouraging results or at least feedback from not only the caregivers. I had caregivers calling me just in tears of joy, saying that their loved one was starting to do things that he or she hadn't done in some cases in years. But we were also getting the staff actually were starting to come around. They were, working with these people, of course, already, and then having them see no change on a drug or one of the 5 or more FDA approved drugs for dementia, doing nothing for these folks. And then as they get started in the supplementation, they start having some changes. But we, because of limitations in the budget, we only had enough money to draw their blood at baseline and 12 months. So we looked at a whole host of, immune function markers, T cell, B cell subsets, cytokines, growth factors, things that we commonly look for, not only for immune function, but for inflammatory status. And then at baseline, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months, we had the neuropsychologist do the cognitive assessment. So we had the combination of the cognitive or the clinical side, and then what was going on at the physiological or the cellular side. So we, at the end of the day, we knew we would have a very rich data set that we could look at different relationships among all these different variables. And again, we wished we had had the funding to do the blood work at 3, 6, and 9 months, but as it turned out, we had at least enough data to show some really nice findings at the end of the day. And hopefully in the next round of research, we'll have a lot more money to have more capacity to do more of these biomarkers at more time points. But we ended up enrolling 34 people. Now, as you can imagine, with these very, very sick people,
yes,
it's not the easiest intervention in the world to run, especially for a 12-month period. So we felt very good at the end of, I think it was about a 2.5-year period of actually running the study, where we had 34 people enrolled. And, of course, if we had, just to be very clear, we had about $150,000 to run this study, maybe a little bit more. But if we had, excuse me, $1 million or $2 million, certainly we could have enrolled maybe every person that was at the center at that time, but we just didn't have that much funding. And of course, there were other studies that were ongoing at the center as well. It wasn't just our study, even though probably most of the people that enrolled in our study were not really competitive candidates for some of the other clinical trials. But nonetheless, the staff only has so much time in the day to be able to engage in different studies as well. So even if we had had a lot of money, we would have either had to have hired more staff or, maybe recruit from a different location. There are other things that go into running a clinical trial, as you know. So at the end of this 2.5 year period, we have this data set of 34 subjects. We have just a mountain of information. We go back and forth, my staff and I, we enter the data, we clean it, we double check it, we do all those things, and then we get it ready and prepared for data analysis. And so Dr. McDaniel and I were, as exciting as we were to look at the things at the cellular level, I think we were even more excited to look at the cognitive change, if there was one, because again, we were getting all this really nice feedback as the study was running about how people were, starting to recall people again, starting to recall even their family, people's names, anniversaries, events, what they had done for a living, lots of different things were happening. So we were hopeful as we were getting ready to do the data analysis, but, until you actually run the statistics, you don't know. So that was the first thing that I wanted to focus on, was the cognitive functioning data. And I didn't mention this before, but we used the ADAS-Cog, which for any of our listeners who do not know, the ADAS-Cog is widely considered to be the gold standard for assessing cognition. And that's particularly true for anyone with dementia or Alzheimer's. So this, this is the Bible, so to speak, to assess someone's cognitive function. And we only had one neuropsychologist in the study, so we had no inter-rater error whatsoever. I mean, this lady was very experienced. She had been doing this kind of work for, I think, about 15 years at that time. So, very knowledgeable about how to assess cognitive function. And we felt very good in having her as part of our team of doing this very critical and important work. So as I start running the data and I'm looking at, these changes, what ends up happening is that we show clinically and statistically significant improvement at 9 and 12 months in cognitive function. And Dr. Mary, I can tell you that, at that moment in my life, that for me as a scientist was like the most exciting thing I had ever discovered. Like it truly, it was one of those moments where I wanted to like immediately run outside and like run around the neighborhood and
Exactly.
kind of like,
Exactly.
right. I mean, it was just so exciting, to have this amazing finding. And of course, I immediately called Dr. McDaniel and I said, hey, Dr. Reg, you're not going to believe what our study showed. And of course, he was thrilled as well. And so for us, it was truly groundbreaking. And that first paper that you mentioned was published in 2013. We've since had 3 other papers that we've published from the study, but that initial excitement that we had in 2013 showing something that to that point, and I think even still today, 10 and a half, 11 years later, no other article has shown the same thing. And you can compare that to the FDA approved drugs for dementia, any other type of dietary supplement, any type of, change in eating behavior, physical activity, exercise, music therapy, acupuncture, hyperbaric oxygen. I mean, just go down the list. And I don't mean to sound arrogant or egotistical about this, but I would encourage any listener to go to PubMed, which is the real gold standard of all the academic research, scientific research that's published in the world. And, don't take Lewis's word for it. I mean, go there, do your own literature search and see if you can find anything else similar in this patient population of these very, very sick and what I think is actually neglected people. I mean, it's truly phenomenal what our dietary supplementation regimen showed on that level. So for us, that was just such a profound, exciting finding. And then even getting into like the cellular and the physiological side, where we showed improvements in inflammation, which obviously you can't look at any branch of medical science today without acknowledging the role and the importance of how chronic inflammation really is related to or is part of the pathology of all chronic disease. Right. And then we showed this really nice improvement in the CD4-CD8 ratio, which is really like an overall marker of how well our immune system functions, with this relationship between pro and anti-inflammatory considerations, or between the helper cells and the cytotoxic cells. That was something that was a very nice finding, again, kind of demonstrating how this polysaccharide-based formula improves overall immune function. And of course, that's not just true for people with Alzheimer's, that's true for any of us. As we age, we want that helper to cytotoxic cell ratio be, intact and be optimal. And then finally, in that first paper, we also showed just under a 300% increase in adult stem cell production. Now, I didn't mention that in addition to these people being so sick and impaired, they also were on average 79.9 years of age. So this was a very, old and sick group of folks. This wasn't like, younger people that were, maybe have a little mild cognitive impairment or something. This was a very old and sick group of people. And then imagine having this CD14 cell go up by just under 300% over that 12-month period. It would have been beautiful if we had had more data, in between, like at 3, 6, and 9, to see what, what the variation was going on there. But nonetheless, showing that improvement over that 12-month period, I mean, for us, that was just staggering. So when you kind of put all of this information together and you see this cognitive improvement, and by the way, I really should emphasize too that in the cognitive function finding, it was not only statistically significant, but it was clinically significant. So what I mean by that is, I mentioned that we had 34 people in the study. If you have hundreds or thousands of people in a study, probably some large epidemiological or observational study, of course you're going to have statistical significance because you've got gigantic numbers. So
Right.
even with a tiny little effect size, you could still have statistical significance.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is you may not have any practical benefit from that, right? I mean, it could be just completely irrelevant on a practical level. But with the ADAS-Cog, we know that because of how it's been validated over the last several decades,
Mm-hmm.
if you have a 4-point or greater improvement in the score, then you know that's clinically meaningful, meaning that it
Mm-hmm.
actually affects someone's personal life, you know, their practical ability to do things. And so we had that was what we showed. So it was both clinically and statistically significant. So it actually impacted people's lives. And, you know, Dr. Mary, I mean, I think for me, I mean, you're a physician, so I can't tell you anything you don't already know. But for me as a scientist, like, that's so rewarding to be able to run research that,
It
you
is.
know, immediately impacts people's lives. And with all due
Exactly.
respect to, you know, my friends and colleagues who are basic scientists running studies on cells or tissues or animals, a lot of times when people are doing that kind of research, it never sees the light of day in terms of translating into human impact. And, you know,
Exactly.
of course, when you're doing stuff on rats or mice, they're never late for an appointment, right? I mean, you don't have to deal with them not calling you or not showing up to a follow-up appointment. They're always there in their cage. With human beings, of course, it's a whole different ball game.
Exactly.
So, you know, it's really challenging to do clinical trials. And again, with all due respect to my bench scientists, I know that what they do is very important, and many times it does end up having an impact on human health, but in many cases it does not. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, having this kind of research and running this kind of study was not just rewarding as a scientist, or, you know, feeling like I did a good job as running the study, and, you know, fiduciary responsibility to the donor and these kinds of things, and actually being ethical and all that. But then to really add, you know, the icing on the cake, if you will, is, hey, guess what? We actually had a study where we showed actual improvement in people's lives, and we could actually help people. So, you know, again, that was just like beyond anything we expected. I mean, we were optimistic and we were hopeful, but it just, that, you know, that study is just, again, and it's still today, even after all these years, when we ran it and then
Mm-hmm.
published and continue, as you know, continuing to publish data from that study. It's without question the you know, the hallmark of my career so far in terms of what I've shown scientifically. So I'm sorry if that was a very long-winded summary
It's
of the study,
not.
but
It's so significant when you think about it. People with moderate to severe Alzheimer's. This is, like you say, this is a population that's not even typically studied.
that's right.
They've been written off.
That's right.
And here you're giving them the nutrients. I want to make sure the audience really understands this. They didn't get anything else. They got the quality nutrients. Now, how did those come? In powder form?
Yes. So we actually had a little bit along the way, we tweaked some of the nutrients. It's mostly a powder form.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it at one point was in a tablet, but for the most part, it was powder. And we knew that going in, I think it's 25% of people with Alzheimer's have swallowing issues. So
Mm-hmm.
we felt like having a powder was much more doable and much more practical for folks with,
Got it.
you know, the most severe form of this disease, to be able to
Mm-hmm.
swallow a powder as opposed to a capsule or a tablet. So
Mm-hmm.
we,
Mm-hmm.
and it turned out we were actually correct. We had several caregivers along the way tell us that their loved one had difficulty with swallowing. But with the powder, of course, as you know, I mean, it's so mixable and it's so blendable with basically anything. I mean, I'm kind of a, I guess you could say, a little bit of a meathead with it. I just simply scoop it straight into my mouth. I don't even put it in water or juice or anything. I just put it
Yep.
straight in my mouth, let a little bit of saliva mix with it, and then swallow it. So, you know, maybe that's a little too
That's
barbaric
fantastic.
for some people, but because of the taste is, you know, it's so mild that you really can mix it with just about anything. I mean, I tell people all the time, you know, smoothie, of course, juice or water, but I think smoothie is, you know, a no-brainer, no pun intended. I mean, that to me is the easiest thing to do. But for people that like yogurt or applesauce, even mashed potatoes. I have some people I know that mix it with their coffee and tea. I just say the only caveat for me is I tell people not to mix it with anything that it's too hot, right?
Okay.
Because not only do you not want to burn your mouth, but you don't want to damage any of the nutrients in the formula. So just don't add it to anything that's boiling hot or very high heat.
Right.
And then, but again, you can pretty much mix it with anything that's already like a mixable kind of food, or just, even oatmeal. I didn't mention oatmeal. That would be another good one. But yes, it's very flexible when it comes to mixing that powder with just about anything.
So when you think about the significance of this, you have to ask yourself, what role does nutrition play in Alzheimer's? I'm here asking myself this. I think about it all the time since you published that study. Is it in part a nutritional deficiency?
I think there's no question about it. I mean, I think there are lots, as I mentioned earlier, as you know, there are lots of different theories on what causes neurodegeneration. There's absolutely no scientific consensus. And the one thing for me that's aggravating as a nutritional scientist is every time I'm reading, these so-called public health or clinical experts out in the world talking about this stuff, they never acknowledge nutrition. Nutrition is like the furthest thing from their mind. They never acknowledge the role that nutrition plays in the health of the brain. And it's fascinating. I mean, we know all of this information related to, take your pick, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, even depression a little bit. There are different nutritional or dietary factors that are acknowledged in all these other chronic diseases. So why is it when it comes to neurodegeneration, nutrition is just completely ignored? I totally don't get it. It's like these people think the brain lives in this bubble or this capsule that's sort of immune or outside of the scope of everything else that goes on between the head, from the head to the toes. It's bizarre, really.
It really is. And this is what you've proven is that it made such a significant impact in the lives of these patients. Now, when we think about nutrition, okay, so you've got several things to think about. You've got today, we talk about this all the time. Okay, the soil is depleted of the nutrients. Okay, it's frighteningly depleted. So you got the depletion, but then you've got the pesticides and the herbicides. Okay, glyphosate, okay, robs the body of the nutrients. So that means we're eating all these vegetables and there's nothing going to the brain.
That's right.
So
don't forget the genetic modification of our plants as well.
Oh, absolutely.
That's another big factor.
Absolutely. It is, because there's no nutrition. So then looking at a future study, and I know you're raising money rightfully for a larger study because there's a lot of unanswered questions. So how would you, set up this study so that you could answer some of those questions?
Well, Dr. Mary, that's a great question. Before I answer that question, if I may, I'd like to tell the listeners that when, I mentioned that I was so excited just before even the paper was published, looking at the data and then seeing these really exciting findings. I mean, I literally was on cloud 9 for a long time. And after we published that first paper, I was even thinking about it before the paper was published, actually. But as I was thinking about our next steps, of course, what do you think of as a scientist in academics? You think of, things like NIH. And of course, in this world, I'm thinking of Alzheimer's Association, right? I mean, these are the two major bodies that I'm thinking of. Okay, these people are going to be really excited about what we've shown. They're going to throw so much money at us. I won't know what to do with all this money. Well, guess what? I could not have been more wrong. I went from the top of the mountain. I don't even think I was in the valley. I think I was below it. I think I went below the valley because I was so dejected and disappointed that I tried on 4 separate occasions, 2 with NIH and 2 with Alzheimer's Association, to get more money to advance our research. And I got nothing. I didn't even get zero. I got crickets in response. I got nothing from these people. And for me, I'm still fairly young in my academic career at that time. This is, again, quite a few years ago, and I'm probably a bit naive at this point. But it dawned on me that it was no wonder that 99% of my colleagues around the university were doing either pharmacology or genetics, because those are the two fields where all the money is. It's not nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
NIH may talk a game, and Alzheimer's Association may talk a little game, but they really have no interest in funding anything that's natural, because at the end of the day, they want to have agreements in place that they can either sell or license to big pharma and then make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on. That's what they're shooting for. So anything that's natural that can't be patented like that, they don't care about it. And again, they can talk publicly about all they want about, what they believe about the role of nutrition, and they may paint a pretty picture publicly, but you can't fool me. I know the score, because I was actually in the trenches, trying to accomplish something. And so that was a big onus for the reason why I actually left academics full time. I just couldn't see myself after making these discoveries. And by the way, that's, I'm only mentioning one. I mean, there are quite a few components to this picture here, but for time's sake, we'll only stick with this one for now. But I really felt like, I would be better served leaving academics and pursuing a career in business and being a science-based business person, trying to continue to raise money for research, but doing it in a much different environment where I could have, kind of the academic shackles removed from me and have more ability to negotiate things and to do things. But I wanted to put that into context because I think it's important for our listeners to know that I really tried advancing this field as much as I could in academics, but when I hit that wall, I just wasn't going to spend the next 20 or 30 years of my life, continuing to make my head bleed. I needed to do something else, because on a personal level, as much as you want to help other people, you still have to, there's still a selfish gene within you to satisfy your own needs and to do things for yourself that make you feel good, and not just feel like you're constantly running around like a bull banging your head against the wall. So anyway, that context is to say that, from that very conventional road, if you're not playing the game in pharmacology and genetics, I'm sorry, you're just kind of like a black sheep. But anyway, to answer your question, I mean, I think there are so many other things. God bless that family for giving us the money they did. I mean, maybe $120,000 or $150,000 sounds like a lot of money to our listeners. And, of course, if it's on a personal level, sure, that's not chump change, right? I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of money. But when you're trying to run a really elaborate and sophisticated clinical trial, that is not a lot of money. I mean, that really is not a lot of money. I mean, we're talking about if we had, 500,000 or $1 million, there are so many other things that we could have added to the design of our study, in addition to, of course, enrolling more people. But, looking at many other things. For example, I mentioned that we didn't do anything related to diet, right? I mean, we didn't touch their diets. And of course, in my other experiences in running clinical trials, I think dietary modification might be the most challenging thing that you can get a human being to do. And, and really, get buy-in and compliance and acceptance. And oh, by the way, with Alzheimer's, we're not just talking about one person, we're talking about at least two, and in some cases, probably 3 or 4, when you have the primary caregiver and then that person needs a break, and then, other people get involved. So it's not just the one person you're studying, you're actually kind of studying at least a dyad, if not maybe a group of people. But I think it would be so important, back to your point about general nutrition, I think it would be so important in our next study that we do a much better job of looking at a lot of these dietary factors, not only in our supplement that we give people that we believe, has the efficacy to help these folks, but we need to have a better understanding of how they're eating every day. If not, try to help, maybe with some basic nutrition education. I'm not necessarily proposing that we intervene with their diet, but they need to have, I mean, a lot of these people, I saw these folks as they're being enrolled in the study, they're overweight, they clearly need nutritional help. So I think it would be very important to have a much more sophisticated look at all the different dietary and nutritional factors in our subsequent trial. So that would definitely be one thing to do. The second thing to do, of course, would be have more elaborate biomarker testing. I mean, we ran a really nice panel in that first study, but there were so many things, you know, let's say left to the imagination that we could have done. I mean, all these different oxidative markers that we didn't look at, genetic expression. I mean, that field has exploded in the last, 10, 15 years. So many different things that we could look at, in relationship to our gene function, the epigenetics of it. I mean, there are just so many questions there that we could answer. And then, just going down the list, I mean, things that you and I have discussed offline, such as, testing for all the different heavy metals. You mentioned glyphosate. I mean, all these different contamination factors. At best, they're like covariates that we need to look at to be able to say, well, we have 100 people in our study and half of them have glyphosate exposure. Exactly. So, and then how does that impact some of our outcome variables? I mean, if nothing else, just to have that kind of information, again, as a covariate or as an explanatory factor in statistical analysis. Maybe we can't really do anything about it in our clinical trial, but at least we have knowledge of it, and we can adjust our statistics based on, other things that we identify along the way. And then, of course, we've talked about viruses and other infections and how actually infection may be related to dementia. There's one of the theories of dementia is that it can be caused by viral infection or maybe even bacteria. So, I mean, that's very interesting. That's something we didn't do in our previous study. Dr. McDaniel mentioned maybe we need to look at how many of their teeth have amalgam fillings. I mean, there are just so many different exciting things. And then the one thing that I think would be really cool, actually two more things I think that would be really cool. One is, and I know it's a bit risky, so we might not get the whole sample to agree to it, but maybe a subsample, we do some spinal taps, because it's interesting to look at what's happening in the periphery in the blood. But when you can get some of that spinal fluid and then look at some of those inflammatory markers, some of those immune function markers, now you're really getting much more local as opposed to a peripheral analysis. So I think that would be really interesting to do. Again, I know spinal taps are not exactly the most risk-free thing, but if you have an experienced person doing that, then hopefully it wouldn't be difficult. And then finally, the last thing that I think we really need to add to it is imaging. Because, a lot of times it's so fascinating to think of how the nutritional intervention would have impacted the morphology of the brain. And then, of course, we know that neuroplasticity is, at least most people, I think, commonly accept that today. So, man, it would be so cool to look at the images of the brain as we go through, say, a 12-month or a 24-month intervention, whatever we decide that to be. But to look at those changes in the brain, and I'm not an expert in the imaging technology. I'm sure you know much more about that than I do. But to be able to look at those changes, to me, would be like, you want to talk about definitive and being able to say that, these polysaccharides with these other nutrients have an effect on the brain, and look at those morphological changes. Wow, now that's your icing on the cake.
Exactly. So there's a lot to look forward to.
There is.
Clearly, we need the funding, and the funding has to come from outside what we consider conventional sources. But it doesn't mean the funding is not out there. I really believe, we really need to reach the right people, the right donors. There's so many people who have been impacted by Alzheimer's. Let's face it, why did you get the first grant? Because this family was devastated.
That's right.
Over the loss of several loved ones. And today, there's not a person who is not a few steps away from someone who had or has Alzheimer's.
That's right.
But we need to raise the awareness that grant money is not flowing for this innovative nutritional research. It really becomes incumbent upon all of us. It's like, wait a minute, this is really important, and it's not invasive. It's not risky. That's
right.
The thing that gets me. A lot of the meds have serious side effects. Okay, this is not hurting anyone. Like Dr. Rich used to say, they
I
give
know.
it to the little animals and they're just running and jumping and they're so happy and healthy.
That's right.
So our colleagues in the labs can say that. You give these nutrients, okay, these animals are so much healthier. And we are talking about people with a degenerative, debilitating condition. It is the saddest thing to see somebody that was so high functioning and they don't know their name.
I know. We
It
had
is,
so many, I'm sorry, I was just going to say,
go
we had so
ahead, go
many
ahead.
highly educated,
Right.
well-established people in their career in our study that, had done so much in their lives. And then, like you said, they're just basically reduced to a piece of furniture. I mean, it's
Yes.
devastating. I think, sometimes we think of, well, what's our, on a personal level, what's our fate? What is it going to be that takes us out? And to me, I think dementia would be the worst way to go. Just to still
Yes.
be here physically, but not remember who you are and remember your spouse, your children, things that you did in your life. I mean, what a horrible fate. But I also wanted to mention something that you touched on as well, related to funding and how, this disease really touches us all today. I think of a few people that, obviously famous, well-known people, for example, Ross Perot, Tony Curtis, Glenn Campbell. Those three men died of Alzheimer's. And, I'm just thinking, especially in Ross Perot's case, I mean, that man had so much money. You wonder what his family, the people who benefited from his wealth and whoever's controlling that wealth today, like, do they have any concept of, trying to help do something for this disease that took their loved one's life? And in the case of some of these other people, I mean, even President Reagan, I believe he had Alzheimer's. I mean, there's so many
Yes.
people we know of that died from this terrible disease, but yet I think, again, to your point about nutrition and its neglect, I think people are so convinced. It's almost brainwashing, really, propaganda by big pharma, that it's only about curative, right? I mean, we never think of prevention. And then
Right.
even when we think of curative, oh, well, it can't be nutrition. It has to be some chemical. And yet you and I both know, and those of us in our circle, we know that's not to be the case. But we're dealing with all these people in the world who don't know what we know, and they don't understand how physiology works. And they certainly don't understand it from
Exactly.
the perspective of treatment, if you will. So I think there are probably lots of people out there with access to a lot of money, but they don't know what to do with it. And even if they had an idea, they would think more pharma related than they would nutrition related.
Right. Well, they see, I mean, people only know what they know. You see the
Right.
big agencies, oh, the big endowments and all this. Of course, they're going to donate there. They don't know that there's such promise with nutrition. And
Right.
let's get back to basics. Okay. Start there. If we can help people with nutrition, then everything else will work itself out. And think about the cost savings. Think about the cost
Oh,
savings alone.
huge.
A lot of these medicines are extremely expensive and they're not effective. I don't know what's the latest statistics on the efficacy rate of these the meds for Alzheimer's. It's not high.
Oh, it's not high at all. And that new
No.
drug that was conventionally or provisionally, sorry, not conventionally approved last year, the year before, I forget the name of it. It's the injectable one. I think that drug costs like $80,000 a year, and it has all sorts of issues with the kidneys. I mean, that's like throwing a
See, exactly.
Band-Aid on a gushing wound. That doesn't even
Exactly.
just,
Well, and a person who is so compromised physically, mentally, and then you throw a medicine that is going to impact the organs with such damage, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, is
that's right.
to what avail? To what avail is that? So it's like, I've said for years with the health reform, it's upside down. And as a group of us, we need to turn this right side up. We really do. and get back to basics. And so we will do what we can. We'll do all we can to get the word out. And I would encourage every one of our listeners we'll have donate buttons, but more importantly, we'll have information that you can share with people, because it's going to take people, all of us.
That's right.
Is based on Dr. John's and his team's experience. Now think about this is such a privilege. We have university level research right here. That in and of itself, don't take that for granted, because most studies like this are not run at this level, at the university level, with all the checks and balances. Am I correct? They're just not.
Totally agree with you. And, you know, again, not to come across as arrogant or egotistical about this, but, you know, any listener that wants to, you know, either read the articles and say, well, hey, what's this guy Lewis talking about? You know, I'm big into drugs, or I'm big into, you know, acupuncture or whatever. Like, you know, I would just encourage anybody to be open-minded and read our articles. I mean, again, this is, as to your point, I mean, this at University of Miami is not Harvard or Duke or Stanford, but, you know, we're a pretty highly rated institution. And, you know, again, we went through the rigor of the entire academic process. I mean, from, you know, designing the study to all the way to the end of publishing. And as I mentioned, we have 4 articles that we published from this first Alzheimer's study. We have 2 articles that we published from a sister multiple sclerosis study. We'll hopefully talk about that in another episode. And we're writing a 3rd paper from the multiple sclerosis study. I mean, we have a lot of evidence here. I mean, this isn't just, you know, some little hokey pokey idea that was published in some no-name journal. I mean, the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease is arguably the journal when it comes to presenting these results for this patient population. So, and oh, by the way, I think there's something else I should mention, Dr. Mary. Only one time in my career, when I submitted a paper for publication, and I have, I don't know, somewhere between 180 and 190 peer-reviewed publications at this point in my life, but only one time in my career after I submitted a paper for publication, and, you know, it's going through the review process, did I actually have the editor of the journal, this Dr. Perry, and he's still the editor of the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease today. He called me after we submitted that first paper for publication, so excited. He said, wow, Dr. Lewis, your paper is amazing. Like, this is going to be published rapidly. And within 30 days, our paper was accepted for publication. That never happened in my life before. I mean, it was like, wow, you know, when you want to talk about validation, his name is Dr. George Perry. I believe he's at the University of Texas, San Antonio. I forget exactly which institution, but, you know, obviously a very well-recognized man in Alzheimer's and dementia. And for him to do that, for me, was just, you know, really validating, and it made me feel so good. And again, that was when I was still riding on cloud 9 for a while. And then unfortunately my cloud dissipated. And that was the end of all that. But nonetheless,
never give up. It could be we're moving into a different phase. Medicine is moving into a different phase. Okay, we know the benefits of nutrition. It's like this has to sink into people. This is not a fluke.
That's right.
These nutrients make enormous difference. So it's like any new scientific discovery. It's a process that people need to begin to accept.
That's right.
And you've done a stellar job, and now we need to press on and educate more. So all our listeners, every one of our listeners, can share this with someone and say, wow, look at this. These patients with serious Alzheimer's got better. With what? Nutrition.
That's right.
Okay, light bulb. And we need to be calling other people and let other people know. And now, oh, any significant discovery in the world, it's met with ridicule,
Right.
as this is ridicule. But look at the results. And yeah, it's time. We really need to raise awareness. And it's so important that you do your next study in a timely fashion. Would you agree?
No question about it. I mean, you know, it's painful for me. I mean, even though I'm no longer full-time in academics, but I, like you, I've still been trying to talk to people and network with people about the importance of extending our research. And even with all the exciting things that I've done since leaving academics full-time, it's a hole in my heart that our research has basically been stonewalled. I mean, I'm still publishing from the same data set, but as we were discussing earlier, there are so many other unanswered questions and so many other things that need to be tapped into, and we can only do that with a new study. And so it's of paramount importance. I mean, I feel like, to your point about this shift in medicine and, you know, shift in maybe our population's consciousness, this would be so important for us. And then, oh, by the way, not just in Alzheimer's, but in cancer and heart disease and diabetes and, you know, and all these other things. And I guess also maybe it's a good point to say that, you know, just for regulatory purposes, you and I are not making any claims about nutrition treating disease. What we're talking about is providing the raw materials that the cells need to function properly. And through that inherent intelligence, the body has its own capacity to heal itself. And wow, that's way more important and, excuse me, way more powerful than treating a disease or a symptom of a disease with one chemical through one metabolic pathway where you alter your physiology. Whereas with nutrition and with our dietary supplement, we're actually enabling our physiology. And so that's a very important distinction to make.
It
And
is.
I don't want anyone to say that Lewis said we're treating disease with nutrition here. I never say that. You'll never hear me say that. So I want to make sure that all of our listeners are clear about that. And there's something else
Well,
also I
want to
think that's
remind
very important.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, please.
You said something else. No. There's something else that's really important.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, I'm sure there must be some of your listeners who maybe look at dietary supplementation with a jaundiced eye. And, you know, it's kind of like the old saying that it only takes one bad apple to spoil the bunch. But I want everybody to know that, you know, you and me and Dr. McDaniel and all the people that we've worked with over the years, we're doing it the right way. I mean, marketing is obviously very important to what we do and spreading the word, but we're still a very science-based group of people here. And we're not just trying to be slick. We're not just trying to, you know, sell product to make money. I mean, this is way bigger than that. And so anybody that thinks that the dietary supplement industry is bad because, you know, one of the things people say, oh, well, the FDA doesn't regulate it. And my response to that is, well, you better be glad they don't. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to afford your dietary supplements. So it's actually part of our freedom of choice that we get to make as consumers to say, well, I'm supporting this company because of X, Y, and Z, and I'm not supporting that company because of A, B, and C. And this is our rights and our privileges and freedoms as Americans. And so be glad that FDA doesn't regulate our supplements. And as far as my part's concerned, they never will if I can do anything about it. But the other thing that I think is important to mention is, and I'm sure this happens to you a lot too, is, you know, a lot of times people will say to me, well, I'm healthy, I eat well, I don't need supplements. And, you know, that's debatable. And that's another long topic that we could go into maybe in another conversation. But the thing about these polysaccharides from aloe vera and rice bran that are so important and so special is that I don't care if you eat a plant-based diet like I have for the last 27 years, or if you're now in the latest craze of, you know, carnivore, paleo, keto, all these really meat-oriented people, or maybe you believe in Zone or South Beach or Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig. I mean, they're just all these different eating philosophies and preferences. But regardless of where you are on that spectrum, you're not getting these polysaccharides from your food. I don't know anyone who eats aloe vera. And even if they did, you know, here in Miami, we have some aloe vera growing out in our backyard, but I don't go out there and cut the leaves and, suck down the gel. If I did, I'd get very little polysaccharide in that gel. It has to be concentrated in a form where it can have a physiological or a therapeutic effect. The same thing with rice. Most of the world, like 70–80% of the rice eaten in the world is white rice. Well, it's had the bran stripped off of it. That's why it's white. The bran gives it that darker color. But the bran is where all those polysaccharides are that have such therapeutic value. So even if you're eating brown rice every day, I eat brown rice, maybe not every day, but most days, but I'm still not getting enough of those polysaccharides in a concentrated dose or amount to really have a therapeutic benefit, especially if I'm dealing with some significant health challenge. So what I tell people is, I don't care what your eating habits or preferences are, to not get these polysaccharides in a concentrated amount every day. And we're only talking, a few hundred milligrams, maybe a couple of grams, again, depending on what you're dealing with. It's not like you're going to, if you're a keto guy, you're going to mess up your glucose or, any of that stuff. You're really talking about a very small amount of material compared to your macronutrition. But these polysaccharides are just so special and so dynamic. And if you're not taking them every day, it's like, in my opinion, it's like missing out on vitamins and minerals. You need these things every single day. And for us, that's the reason why these things work, because they're not in the diet. And as soon as you introduce them in, it's like the cell saying, wow, now I can function again. And now I can heal myself. And so this is why, these are a couple of reasons why supplementation is so important. And I just wanted to make that point before we concluded today, because I feel like that's very important for any of our listeners to understand here.
Well, this has been such an enlightening conversation. And I want to take this opportunity, Dr. John, to thank you, because you have not given up. Your level of expertise, got you to that point where you could be the lead investigator of this groundbreaking research. That didn't just happen. There's tremendous amount of discipline, studying, right? That got you, even that you were so interested in nutrition. Okay. So it was just a perfect combination. And I want our listeners to understand that. And with gratitude for all you have done, I say for patient care, because it's people, it's helping people. So yeah, we're supremely grateful to you. Now, our challenge is to take this information, digest it, so to speak, and then share with others. Share with others and let others know. Because the only way at this point that studies will, your next study will be funded, it will be individuals. And like you said, maybe we can reach some of those individuals whose loved ones, lost that battle with Alzheimer's. But it is critical right now, absolutely critical. The rates are not going down of Alzheimer's.
Right.
They're only going up.
No, it's not.
And you know what? The other thing is the cost to the caregivers. Spouse and the close family. This is just absolutely devastating.
It's tragic.
And you've met many of them.
I have, and I have colleagues who do research on caregivers of Alzheimer's, and the science is actually pretty clear that the caregiver of someone with Alzheimer's is far worse on his or her health than the caregiver of someone with cancer or even HIV or heart disease or any of those other diseases. The person dealing with someone with Alzheimer's, that caregiver's health is also just tragically affected. So it's not just the person with the disease, it's the people around that person with the disease that also get really tragically affected. So you're absolutely right. This is such a need, and it's so important. If we have listeners out there that, like you said, can spread the word, and if they know someone who maybe has, the resources to help us out, it would be phenomenal. And it would be, something that you could pass on as your legacy to helping humanity, basically.
Absolutely. And I want to say this also, because we think in terms of big numbers. You know what? If you can donate $5, $10,
absolutely,
a lot of people donating those small amounts, the math is the same. At the end of the day, you get the big amount, but it is a lot of people with those small amounts. And then if you get a few with a larger amount, well, then you got the job done.
That's right.
So again, our heartfelt thanks, Dr. Lewis. This has been phenomenal, and we're going to do this again. And there's a lot to talk about. So,
Thank you, Dr. Mary.
Okay, final closing words.
Well, I'm just, again, grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you today. And thank you for all of the kind words and compliments. I mean, I'm not a one-man show. I have a lot of colleagues that I depended on in my career. No, no one does this research alone. And so I'm grateful to Dr. McDaniel, among other people, and all the other folks that I've worked with. And so I think anybody listening to me can tell that I'm very passionate about this work. And, this isn't something that's just kind of silly to me or just something that I'm looking at as making a living. I mean, I live this, I breathe it. Anything that I recommend to other people is exactly what I do for myself and my family. And I don't take that level of credibility lightly. I mean, I think your reputation is so important. And I've spent all these years building that. And so I just hope that people understand that, the authenticity here is completely real and legitimate. And anybody that donates to us to help us out here, I promise you, I'll do the best work I can to make sure the money's well spent and help to, again, help people and advance our science. I mean, that's what I'm going to continue doing the rest of my life till my last breath.
Again, we thank you so much, and really look forward to more conversations. Thank you, Dr. John.
Thank you, Dr. Mary.